My high school English teacher taught us that all good literature has underlying messages about sex and suffering. She was wrong, but she was onto something. Experts have known since the beginning of time that suffering is an integral part of life. In fact, every story ever written is about pain. And I think you'll understand why by the end of this video.
Life is pain, Highness. Anyone who says differently is selling something.
The fact that there is pain in the world is a problem for people who believe in an all-powerful, all-loving God. Many atheists see this as the strongest proof against God's existence. It turns out, though, that the fact that everyone suffers disproves a naturalistic worldview. Check it out. First, let's go through the typical explanations of why God allows pain and debunk them. There are some easy possible solutions. This problem is no longer a problem if there is no God, or if he's not all-loving. But these options aren't feasible for those of us who have had personal experience with a loving God.
I had Jesus appear to me 3 years ago. I was in my room and he appeared to me and he came and he gave me a big hug. He lifted me up, he turned me around, and the joy was unlike this world.
The next option is that maybe God is not all-powerful. Perhaps God is incredibly smart and powerful, but there's a force of evil or moral entropy that he's battling. He can keep it at bay enough to create a beautiful world with intelligent creatures, but he's not quite powerful enough to conquer and eradicate the source of evil. This is an interesting idea, but it doesn't work for me. If God can part the Red Sea and heal a paralyzed man, can't he prevent my mom from getting cancer? The final theodicy that I'll present and debunk is that all suffering will be redeemed. A simplified version of this is that God allows us to live through awful pain, but once we reach infinite joy in the next life, we'll look back and say that it's all worth it. He will compensate us for the suffering that he allowed us to go through. This could even be true for animals. But if God is all-powerful and perfectly loving, why doesn't he just give us infinite joy without having us pass through a fallen world?
God might cause them to suffer a bunch and then essentially redeem them in the afterlife, but what for? Like, why do this? If I were to punch you in the face and then give you $20,000 afterwards, you might be grateful for the $20,000, but why couldn't I just give you the $20,000?
In Christian terms, why didn't God send Jesus right after Adam and Eve partook of the fruit and redeem the world then and there? Or better yet, he could not create the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the first place. The redemption model also doesn't seem to work for people who didn't happen to accept Jesus in this life and will therefore spend eternity in hell. Much ink has been shed over this question. C.S. Lewis wrote a whole book on it. He and others have made some progress when they talk about free agency. Lewis rightly points out that for humans to truly have free will, God needs to allow us to commit sin, including hurting other people. If God prevented all evil, then it would be impossible for us to make meaningful choices. This is a solid point. Some atheists even concede this.
Say, like, it seems plausible at least that a human can suffer and then be sort of better off for it, or that they can enjoy poetry of suffering, the poetry of suffering.
But what about hurricanes and forest fires? These are literally called acts of God on my homeowner's insurance policy. Can't God prevent this gratuitous suffering? Also, what about Calvinists? They don't have free will, and they suffer all the time. Also, what about animal suffering? Animals don't seem to have moral will. Why do they suffer?
But I want you to really consider the plight of animals on planet Earth. And not just those animals that we systematically abuse in those ignoble torture chambers we call factory farms, but consider a deer whose leg is trapped under a fallen branch and starving to death in not just fear and agony, but also confusion. Is this a part of the suffering that's necessary to obtain whatever God has morally sufficient reason to desire? Could that deer have not have died 5 minutes earlier? Could its hunger not have been just marginally reduced? Why should this proposed sufficient reason require exactly this amount of suffering and no less? Why can't this deer be granted some form of mercy? Why can't it being granted some form of mercy, be compatible with whatever God apparently desires, like free will or higher order goods or whatever it may be? Is it not compatible with the existence of free will for this deer to have died 30 seconds before it did? And what good is this obtaining anyway? Remember, I'm talking about natural evil here, not moral evil. How could this deer's agonizing and unseen death be a necessary requirement for human free will, or some higher order good or something? Does it somehow help shape the moral character of those human beings who aren't even aware that the deer is suffering and never find out that it did? Does it somehow help the animal? And if so, how exactly? At least for humans, the religious expect some kind of divine compensation in the afterlife for their suffering. But what does the deer get? I imagine this deer, not to mention the 72 billion land animals we slaughter each year, not to mention the sea life we do the same to, not to mention the many, many more animals that are killed by their natural environment, I doubt these animals are going to experience the bodily resurrection promised to us by Jesus Christ. So what exactly is the reward for their suffering? And why does that suffering need to be exactly so high, exactly so ubiquitous, and exactly so deep and so agonizing?
There is a fundamental reason why Almighty God cannot prevent suffering. I'll start to show it to you by asking a question. Atheists, if you were God, which suffering would you prevent? I think we would all place starving children, war, genocide, and disease at the top of the list. But how far down the list would you go? Would you prevent poverty? Would you prevent danger? Would you prevent us from feeling the pain of unrequited love? What about your discomfort from coming down with a cold? Would you prevent boredom? What about the pain that I'm feeling right now because I'm not currently winning the lottery? The God who could deliver this grown-up Christmas list is as realistic as Santa. Now, let me explain the dissonance in this idea logically. First, some definitions.
Suffering can be just defined as an experience which is not wanted when experienced, broadly speaking. You know, being a bit uncomfortable in your chair, having to walk upstairs, having to stand up and sit down, all of these acts that you don't even think about, when you actually add them up, it's quite a lot of menial suffering that goes on.
Watching that last clip actually connected the dots for me on the thesis of this video.
What possible meaning could there be in subbing your toe, or tripping over a curb, or having a pigeon use your new suit as a restroom? Such instances are not significant. They're usually forgotten within a day or two, and therefore do not and cannot develop the soul. Nor do they seem plausibly part of some grand design or plan. They seem, that is to say, meaningless and unnecessary. More meaninglessness than instances of, let's say, great or intense suffering, much more meaningless than these. And truly meaningless, unnecessary suffering is certainly more expected in a world without benevolent supervision than in a theistic paradigm. A successful theodicy, in other words, then, needs to provide not only an account of the great and intense sufferings of the world, but also the menial sufferings which pervade the human experience.
Now let me establish some premises. First, pain is not an ontologically independent object. It is a phenomenon that happens in the context of consciousness. By that I mean that there are no clumps of pain floating around in the world that we unfortunately bump into and feel. Pain only exists inside our own understanding of what we experience. Number two, pain is always relative. It does not have an intrinsic magnitude. This is why doctors use a pain scale to determine how much a patient is suffering. I once totaled my dad's car while on a date in high school, and I ripped open my arm from my wrist to my elbow. And after we rode an ambulance to the hospital, a nurse asked me to rate my pain on a scale from 1 to 10. I asked her what that even meant, and she said that 10 is the worst pain you can imagine. I told her I have a pretty good imagination, and I proceeded to describe to her the worst pain that I could imagine at that moment. I think she ended up writing down a 2 on her chart. But if I think about it longer, I can always imagine something worse than that worst pain that I came up with. Pain is relative to other potential outcomes. For us to experience pain, we need to have the potential to have a better experience. The opposite is also true. We experience pleasure when we feel something that we value as more desirable than what we otherwise could have felt. Pain is a direction, not a location. It's a comparison, not a quantity. So, if pain only happens within consciousness, what is consciousness? Philosophers, scientists, and theologians struggle to define what consciousness is. Let's start with the apophatic approach and define what it is not. Consciousness is not merely the detection of sensations. It's also not just quantifying those sensations. Consciousness is not even synthesizing information from multiple sensations and drawing conclusions based on it, or generating content based on it. Computers can do all of those things, and yet we don't say that computers have consciousness. I submit that consciousness is evaluating sensations as more or less desirable. It is the ability and practice of assigning value to those sensations, desiring some circumstances over others. In 12 Rules, Jordan Peterson says,
Number 1, the collective pursuit of any valued goal produces a hierarchy, as some will be better and some worse at that pursuit, no matter what it is. And number 2, it is the pursuit of goals that in large part lends life its sustaining meaning. We experience almost all the emotions that make life deep and engaging as a consequence of moving successfully towards something deeply desired and valued. The price we pay for that involvement is the inevitable creation of hierarchies of success, while the inevitable consequence is difference in outcome. Absolute equality would therefore require the sacrifice of value itself, and then there would be nothing worth living for.
Jordan Peterson says that if we don't value one outcome above another, then life is not worth living. I take that one step further and claim that if something cannot value one potential experience above another, then it is not conscious. We cannot be conscious unless we identify one set of potential outcomes as better and the opposite set of circumstances as worse. If the definition of pain is sensations that are less desirable than their alternatives, then we cannot be conscious without the potential to experience suffering and joy. We need both. We don't suffer in this life so that we can have poetry or courage. We suffer because the fact that we are conscious means that we have preferences about what happens to us, and we define the less desirable outcomes as pain. This is even true for animals. The deer with its legs stuck under the fallen branch, who's being eaten alive by a mountain lion while starving, is only suffering because it considers this outcome so much worse than many alternative experiences it can remember and imagine. If a rock that gets pulverized with a jackhammer or ripped apart by dynamite doesn't suffer, that is because it is not conscious. It cannot imagine or desire potential alternatives. God could create a world with waterfalls, volcanoes, and wind with no suffering. Maybe it could even have trees and flowers. But the instant he allows one of his creations to become a conscious observer, an entity with preferences, God allows suffering to occur. The problem of evil claims that God should have the power to make humans and animals conscious and unconscious at the same time. It is asking him to create a square circle. As a physics analogy, consciousness is a dipole of equal and opposite potentials. Like a magnet or voltage or other relative potentials, you can't have one without the other. This doesn't mean that everyone experiences both pain and pleasure in equal amounts all the time. If you stand next to the North Pole of a magnet, you're going to feel it more than the South Pole, but the South Pole is still there. Okay, you say, but isn't there gratuitous suffering? Could God eliminate that? The answer is yes, and there are 3 ways he could. Option 1, God could decrease the potential for beings to suffer by decreasing our consciousness. But that would necessarily also decrease our potential for joy. It would be numbing. But we don't need God to do that. People achieve that already by drinking. Dulling our senses essentially closes the gap between our potential pleasure and our potential pain. Maybe God made us more conscious than he should have. I suppose we could accuse him of that, but I choose to trust his divine wisdom. I actually believe that we start out with low levels of consciousness when we're born, but that one of the purposes of life is to grow our capacity to feel, and that obedience and sacrifice are mechanisms that God uses to increase our capacity for joy and suffering, to increase our consciousness, our divine potential.
For Neumann and for Jung, consciousness struggles upwards toward the light. Its development is painful and anxiety-provoking as it carries with it the realization of vulnerability and death. It is constantly tempted to sink back down into dependency and unconsciousness and to shed its existential burden. It is aided in that pathological desire by anything that opposes enlightenment, articulation, rationality, self-determination, strength, and competence. By anything that shelters too much and therefore smothers and devours. Such overprotection is Freud's Oedipal familial nightmare. People, including children, who are people too, after all, don't seek to minimize risk. They seek to optimize it. They drive and walk and love and play so that they achieve what they desire. But they push themselves a bit at the same time, too, so they continue to develop. Thus, if things are made too safe, people, including children, start to figure out ways to make them dangerous again. When untrammeled and encouraged, we prefer to live on the edge. There, we can still be both confident in our experience and confronting the chaos that helps us develop. We're hardwired for that reason to enjoy risk, some of us more than others. We feel invigorated and excited when we work to optimize our future performance while playing in the present. Otherwise, we lumber around sloth-like, unconscious, unformed, and careless.
Another option is that God could simply eliminate the possibility of what we now consider painful outcomes. But then the worst remaining outcomes would become the new pain, our first world problems. And the distance between the best and the worst possible outcomes would decrease, again, decreasing our consciousness. This would be like cutting the South Pole off of a magnet. A new South Pole would immediately appear.
Me waking up, oh no, I already know what's about to happen. Seeing my phone didn't charge, nah bro, because this is actually the worst feeling, dude. And then you have to go the whole day knowing that your phone is about to die. Like, that's the actual worst feeling.
If God eliminated all less desirable outcomes, it would be like removing the darkness in this video. That dimension of reality would stop existing. We would not experience anything. And as the Book of Mormon says, God would cease to be God. The third option is that God could maintain the magnitude of our consciousness, that is, maintain the difference between our potential joy and our suffering, but shift it up the spectrum, away from the most horrific suffering. This is essentially the aim of civilization. My question is, how do you know where we are on the absolute pleasure-pain spectrum? What if God has already mercifully placed us near the top? For example, let's arbitrarily choose medieval conceptions of heaven and hell as the definitions of ultimate joy and ultimate suffering. An objective description of the lives of many people in the world today seems much closer to paradise than eternal conscious torment. In fact, whole books have been written describing the awfulness of eternal damnation. But Christians can't seem to imagine anything much better for heaven than pretty gates and good music. So maybe God has made the world as painless as possible, as close to heaven as possible. But if my theory is true that potential pain is always equal and opposite to the potential pleasure, then there is no absolute pleasure-pain spectrum. It's all relative. If suffering could be avoided by preventing painful circumstances, then surely in the last 100 years, pockets of people would have sprung up who were constantly happy. But despite the advances of civilization and technology, many people in the developed world still experience profound suffering. In fact, everyone does. Not to mention the day-to-day annoyances. So, to summarize, God could not create a world with conscious beings in it without suffering. Not because he doesn't love us enough or he's not powerful enough, but because that is a contradiction in terms. And I believe that God is subject to the law of non-contradiction. God is doing the best he can. He's doing all that anyone or anything could. The irony in this discussion is that the fact that we are conscious and have the capacity to suffer is difficult to explain in a naturalistic worldview. Intelligence cannot be created or made out of biology, chemistry, and physics. So, my atheist friends, it looks like the problem of pain is yours. Now, the purpose of this video is to explain why God cannot eliminate suffering. It is not meant to counsel or comfort people who are suffering. That is what the gospel of Jesus Christ is for. As we face a world growing our potential for pleasure and pain, if we accept Jesus as our Savior, we can press forward with peace and approach the throne of grace with confidence.
We can argue about God being all good, all powerful, and if he was this, he could do that, and none of us has ever been satisfied with that kind of an argument, as I think you were essentially pointing out. And that's because when we've done all the philosophical arguing, we're presented with two things that I call beauty and barbed wire. We're presented with a mixed world and a mixed picture. And we have to try to make sense of it. And when you factor that in, there comes a huge question. Could God not have made a world in which this kind of thing doesn't happen? Couldn't he have made a world in which human beings don't do these awful things to one another? Well, the answer to the latter question is, of course he could. We can make such worlds. They're called robotic worlds, but there are no humans in them. We're wishing ourselves out of existence if we say, could God not have made a world in which people are incapable of doing evil? Because evil is the flip side of the capacity to do good. And so the deep question for me is this. Granted that there's beauty and barbed wire, is there any evidence anywhere in the universe that there is a God who could be trusted with it? And my very brief answer, Betsy, to that is this, that at the heart of Christianity, there is a cross. And whatever that tells you, if the central claim of Christianity is correct, that Jesus is God incarnate, then that's God on a cross. And I ask myself the question, what's God doing on a cross? Well, one thing it tells you is that God has not remained distant from the problem of human suffering, but has himself become part of it.
I'm just beginning to explore this idea. I would love to discuss it with you. It's already raised a bunch of questions in my mind. For example, how does God decide when to miraculously intervene? Also, this theory necessarily rejects the impassibility of God, and it runs counter to the medieval conception of heaven. So, stay tuned for videos on those topics. And as I always say, let's keep learning.